Hello and welcome. My name is Rob O'Malley, and I'm a project director at AAAS, and this is the Dynamic Past, how science helps give voice to silent stories. You're all very welcome. The pre-recorded videos on the meeting platform, to view those, you just need to scroll down to the related tab, and you will see those. Through this virtual platform, I'm grateful that we are able to gather from all over the country and the world. I also want to gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Indigenous peoples whose ancestral homelands many of us are joining this meeting from. I am joining you from Central Maryland, the ancestral homeland of the Indigenous Piscataway people. This session was organized by the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER program. DOSER's been around since about 1995, with the goal of fostering communication and engagement about science between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these often overlap. Our program has several active projects. The first is Science for Seminaries, in which we collaborate with seminary and theological schools across North America to incorporate forefront science into their core curricula. We have an Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue program, which is more focused on scientists in a partnership with the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. We've provided workshops, hosted public and science society events, created toolkits, hosted an award program, and created other resources to support scientists in inclusive and constructive engagement with diverse communities, particularly faith communities. We have other active collaborations with external partners to support science engagement within Jewish communities, fostering science engagement in seminary and theological schools in the UK, and encouraging faith groups to participate in community science projects through the Zooniverse platform. New projects and activities are already in development for the coming months and years, so please stay tuned. We have a lot of material online, and so I do encourage you to check out our websites, both the AAAS site itself and our new resource website, and the links are there. You can learn about our programs and collaborations, see videos of past events, view a mini documentary film series, sign up for our newsletter, and access an ever-growing library of resources to support culturally inclusive engagement about science, particularly with faith communities. Our program will be marking our 25th anniversary this June in an event we have dubbed DOSERCon, and we hope you will join us for that event as well. DOSER's been very active at this meeting. Our Indigenous Knowledge Symposium on Monday was fantastic and should still be available on the meeting platform through the end of the meeting. It'll also be available to the public on our website in a few weeks. And I also want to extend my very sincere thanks to the presenters and respondent in that session. Tomorrow we have one final event, a workshop on environmental justice that we encourage you to attend. You can stay connected with us again through our websites. You can find us on Twitter, and we also have a presence on Facebook. So please do check that out. We always love to hear from you. So with that, we're going to open our session. I am very sorry to say that Joycelyn Davis of Africatown Chess and the Clotilda Descendants Association will not be able to join us for this meeting. She sends her sincere regrets. In her extraordinary presentation, she talks about the Clotilda, which was the last slave ship to bring enslaved Africans from Africa to the United States, the extraordinary individuals who survived that terrible act in 1860, the ship's rediscovery by historians, archaeologists, and community representatives in 2019, and the challenges and opportunities facing their descendants today in Mobile, Alabama, and elsewhere. I very strongly encourage you to watch that presentation along with the other presentations, and to visit the websites of Africatown Chess and the Clotilda Descendants Association, which my colleague Curtis Baxter has put in the chat window on the meeting platform. And I'd also now like to invite our other presenters and to introduce themselves and maybe say a few words about their presentations before we move to a more open discussion about silent stories. And Jada, I'd invite you to begin.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Rob and Curtis for putting this panel together. I think there's a lot of really important insights that the other panelists offer, and I'm glad that we can come together to discuss this. So my name is Jada Ben-Torres. I am a genetic anthropologist at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. So first and foremost, I'm an anthropologist interested in questions of what makes us human and more about the human experience. And I focus on genetics to address those sorts of questions. So my contribution or role on this panel is really to think about silent stories and what genetic anthropology offers to, I guess, unsilence these voices. So in my presentation, I kind of begin with things that have moved me in the past few years, but in particular the Black Life movement, and how that has encouraged me to really think about how what it is I do, whether it's research or in the classroom, how that interacts and allows us to talk more about perspectives that have been overlooked. So in my own research, I do, for example, genetic ancestry in Caribbean populations, so that we can look at DNA to learn more about the relationships of individuals there, tell us something about the history of different communities. I spend a fair amount of time talking about my most recent project in Puerto Rico, where I'm working with a contingent of Afro-Puerto Ricans. And conventionally, this subpopulation has been overlooked. Aside from music, culinary traditions, they're generally kind of marginalized. Genetic studies that have been done in Puerto Rico tend to play down African ancestry, though there are, like I said, a strong contingent on the island who are very much aware of and connected to this particular aspect of their heritage. So I've done some projects with them and learned a little bit about the genetic ancestry. But I would say, what's most influential, what's most moving in this project is that I'm working with the community, and they are both intellectually and emotionally invested in this project. What we aim to do is really just do the genetic ancestry testing, find out kind of the results, give it back to the community, and then allow them to interpret it in their own medium. Give us their stories, say their stories, vocalize their perspectives in terms of making sense of the genetic data. I say this, and I always have to offer a disclaimer with genetic work, is that genetics is not the end all. It's not the end all or be all. Genetics has to exist within kind of a cultural context. It's not in a vacuum. So having the ethnographic stories, having people invested in understanding both the science and how we interpret it and the limitations to these interpretations, that's all part of the project. And I will be happy to give more details, but I look forward to seeing what my other panelists have to say as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And now Whitney.
Hi, my name is Whitney Battle Baptiste. I am a professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UMass Amherst, and also I'm director of the W.B. Du Bois Center, also at UMass in the Du Bois Library. My presentation was actually reminding me of aspects of my work that I kind of started off with. So I was talking a lot about the ways, the material ways. I'm an archaeologist, sorry. And I specialize in post-contact archaeology, which would be, and you guess why it's called post-contact, would be after 1492. So that's the apparently cutoff date for historical, which is usually called historical archaeology, but that's a weighted term as well. So what I wanted to look at is examples of the ways in which materially captive Africans had various ways of navigating their lives under captivity and the system of slavery. In this sense, the United States is a very Christian country. And I think that what I did was look specifically at two sites. One was in Annapolis, Maryland, where not exactly where Rob is, but close. And also in on the Levee Jordan plantation in outside of Houston, Texas. The reason those two stood out in my mind is because they're examples of the ways in which the materials that were left behind are indications of what some would call alternative practices for protection, ways in which you call on the understanding of, you know, ancient forms of or traditional forms of faith practices, and to understand that captive folk had a need to protect themselves as well. Not only do we understand through archaeology that there are ways in which captive folk have to navigate slavery, but also teach their children how to navigate slavery. Slavery is not something you're born understanding how to navigate. Therefore, much like today, which I think is a reflection of the ways in which I'm raising two sons, so they are growing up as two African-American men who will be African-American men. I have to have, and my husband have to have certain conversations with them. These were very, you know, about how to interact with police, authorities, you know, the ideas behind the ways in which racialization and anti-Black racism have kind of filtered the ways in which police see African-American men and women, for that example, for that matter, but also the fact that there are strategies that we all have as people of African descent to understand how to survive in a system that is established by this binary we called race in terms of Black and white. And so my talk was really looking at specific examples of artifacts that speak to an alternative way of protection. For example, using the Orisha, which is a deity from the southern part of Nigeria, which is now Nigeria, Ogun as a protector. And so I looked at specifically the example found in a house that was abandoned and everything fell into the house. Fell into the house as in the house stayed where it was and all the materials stayed exactly pretty much where we think they were originally. And we see ways in which certain objects are placed at the door, certain objects are placed in places that speak to not everyone was understanding that Christianity was the only way. And so that was my presentation in a nutshell. And I look forward to having the conversation around that.
Thank you. I have many questions. So I just wanted to note our respondent has not been able to join. I'm hoping he'll be able to join shortly. We'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for those summaries. I was really struck, Dr. Battle-Baptiste, by your comment about, you know, what a loaded term it is, and it's true that, like, we talk about historical archaeology beginning in 1492, and I think that's a really interesting lead-in to ask, how has science and scientists been complicit in silencing stories historically, and what are and today, we don't want to frame it only as a thing that happened in the past, and what are some things that are happening or that need to be happening to address that reality? And that can be to both of you if either of you have comments.
I can start. I think it's a simple answer, but I'm trying to make it more difficult than it should be. I think to me, the foundation of it all is to open up the spaces in which we train scientists, anthropologists to understand that we have scientists, archaeologists, geneticists that are Indigenous, we are Black, we are women, we are, you know, Latinx, we are Asian, which is, I know is a big space to say just Asian, but what I'm saying is that for me, it is the role of those of us who were not traditionally in in these particular fields, that our life experiences and who we are, I think very much so shape the kinds of interpretations and the kinds of questions and the kinds of projects that we engage in. And I don't think that that makes it less scientific. I think that broadens the perspective of what science can address. I mean, the idea of the work that Jada is doing is essential to understanding that genetics is should not be used as a tool, right, of exclusion and or to find some kind of purity. And I don't want to speak on Jada's um, um, uh, area, but it is really from the perspective of an indigenous archaeologist or an archaeologist of Mexican ancestry that digs a site on the border, has a very different conversation with the communities that are impacted by her interpretations, or as an indigenous person that is either from the community or from let's say an adjacent community, and how those interactions with the public or the communities again that are impacted by the science and the materials that we're trying to interpret and do, I think adds a layer that is at this point in our history, like 2021, are no longer, they're no longer acceptable to ignore our perspectives in the movement forward for science.
Thank you. Jada, did you also want to weigh in on that?
I do. I think there are many ways in which science and scientists, historically and even now, have been complicit in silencing different voices. The way in which we teach science sometimes, that there's kind of this linear progression of ideas and there's always right ideas. We don't necessarily see other ideas. We don't always teach about other people who have contributed, made great contributions to scientific progress, maybe because they weren't the quote unquote right color or the right sex or gender. These things happen just even in science education. Last semester, for example, I was teaching a group of first year students, and we were doing a segment on eugenics. And I was very mindful about including the role of American scientists, American anthropologists, geneticists, who shaped eugenic policy in the United States, which was then exported to Nazi Germany, leading to these horrific things like the Holocaust. And many of my first year students were very surprised that they were 19, 20 years old, never heard of this before, were completely, shocked that American scientists had a role in this. So I think there's failures in our science education to provide a broader understanding of science, of how it works, who's contributed, and where these ideas come from. Another factor I think that's important to mention, and Dr. Battle Baptiste has mentioned this, is the scientists who are doing the work. It is very important when you are working with marginalized communities that they see or understand or have a sentiment that they are in some ways represented in that lab. It means to see somebody who looks like you doing the work, it gives you some reassurance that they understand what all this work means to you. So diversifying people that do archaeology, that do genetics, that do anthropology, these are all very, very important efforts in order to make sure that marginalized voices are understood and then are seen. I would like to also mention in terms of, I think I see a comment here in the chat about finding audiences for these stories. I think we are the audience. Educators are the audience. It's the matter of finding information and then making sure that we find ways to disseminate it to our students, to our communities. The works of like Harriet Washington. She wrote a book called Medical Apartheid. It was a phenomenal book, kind of chronicling the uses of Black bodies in the Americas, starting with colonial times all the way through the 1980s. The work of Deidre, I think it's Cooper Owens. She has a book about medical bondage is what it's called. And again, how Black women's bodies, and Irish immigrants, in fact, too, were used to build modern gynecology. And, there's also the work of Dorothy Roberts, who's kind of looking at how race is used in biomedicine and the impacts it has on today's medical care. So the audience is there. It's just a matter of finding, ways to get it out, to affect policy.
Thank you. So in thinking about that question of audience and finding ways to communicate these important stories, I wonder if you could both comment on the role of non-scientists, and that can include community elders, knowledge keepers, including religious leaders, in sort of rediscovering or spreading and boosting these important stories in your work or in your just experience as people.
So I can begin this question. I think the role of non-scientists, particularly in my research, I'm most excited when community members want to participate or approach me in doing research projects. When again they are intellectually and emotionally invested in some aspect where I can use the tools of genetics and the tools of anthropology to address questions that they have. For me, it's these sorts of questions that bubble up from the community that are the most interesting to look at. And this, on my end as a scientist, I think it's also very important to insist upon in our journals, wherever we publish this work, that our community has access to it, and that their voices, their contributions to our work comes through in these published formats.
I think in looking for, looking at audiences, I think that part of a little bit of the difference is that in terms of cultural anthropology and the slight difference that we have in archaeology is that the idea is that everything that we're excavating is from the past, so that there's literally no connection, and not no connection, but the connection is extremely limited. And it happens both ways. For example, when I was much younger in doing archaeology, I wanted to talk to community members about their images and memories of slavery, right? And like, this is like it was way after slavery, right? So how would the folks that I'm talking to know? They're like, I mean, I can tell you stories that I've read in books, but so what I understood from that is that I needed to understand the perspective. So this was Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, where I did my dissertation work. And what that was finding out about what segregation looked like in Hermitage, Tennessee, right? Like, how did the community view the space that I was working on every day? And then to come to find out that I was one of the very few, actually probably the only African-American that was paid to work there, right? Like, that's a very deep thing to consider. And what that does is it allows you to understand, or allows you to create different ways of communicating with a variety of audiences, the connections of a place that has like this historical, ideal of what it was, and the reality of what archaeology is teaching that's a little bit and slightly different. And so I think that it's interesting that archaeologists and non-anthropologists or non-geneticists have an essential role in, for us to understand, because I'm not from Tennessee, I'm from New York City. So I need to understand what the context of how this place is within the Black community there, because just because we might share some ancestral, connections. I don't know what it's like to be from Tennessee. I'm from the Bronx. Like, that does, So, and it's also the assumption from my white colleagues that because I am a Black woman, that I can go to Tennessee and just, understand Blackness in Tennessee, or in the Bahamas where I also worked. I'm not Bahamian, so I don't understand that. So without that community connection, I don't even understand, not the impact on science, right? And what my interpretation is, but how does my interpretation impact the place where people are still living?
Thank you. Yeah, there in our workshops and engagement, we often talk about this concept of cultural humility, which is something that emerged from um, uh, culturally informed medical practice by scholars of color, and I think that's really critical in all kinds of engagement that involves, community and how we involve how we approach communities with humility and not making assumptions and inviting them to share what they want to share. I do want to welcome Reverend Robert Turner to introduce himself and to join us, and then we can include him in the conversation. Welcome, Reverend Turner.
Good evening. Thank you all for having me.
So, Reverend Turner, do you want to introduce where you're from?
Yes, well, I'm originally from Alabama, Tuskegee, Alabama, to be exact. I went to the University of Alabama, and Dr. Batiste had the great pleasure of working with one of your colleagues, Dr. Shabazz, he and his wife. And in fact, I just did a forum for their class a few months ago. And I now pastor and reside in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Historic Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church is where I reside and where I work, and we are the only edifice that is still on Greenwood that was there before and during the 1921 race massacre of 1921. We have seen the worst. I'm also the individual who raised the question about mass graves to our mayor, and we have now a public oversight mass grave excavation committee that I sit on. Throughout the last 13, 14 months, we've had several national guests come through. One of them, your senator, Dr. Batiste, Cory Booker from New Jersey, he's come by here. Elizabeth Warren has come through here, and several others, to just see and be at ground zero of this place, and where we still are seeking justice and fighting for reparations.
Thank you. So, Reverend Turner, in your role as pastor at that site, the site of this genocide, you have had an opportunity to sort of experience how scientists and others can sort of support the community and support community interests and concerns. And I was wondering if you could maybe share some thoughts about what you would like to see scientists doing when they are engaging with communities around these topics that are very fraught, that have this very that have both elements of justice in them, but also emotion and personal history and family history. If you could maybe comment on that, like what, for scientists who are moving into this space, what should they be doing?
They shouldn't treat it as a mere scientific experiment. This is family, community, societal struggle and history. It is not just a laboratory. Greenwood is still a crime scene, not just a chemical laboratory. And it's far too often, because scientists are so brilliant and so educated and so informed and so intelligent. They see what their end goal is, but oftentimes don't really appreciate the community and societal aspect, the ramifications of what they do. And so, not speaking down, because scientists, you always pretty much are the smartest and most formally educated group of people in the room. But it's important in how you interact with people, and not to, be condescending and speaking down to folks all the time when they're simply just trying to raise questions. For instance, here in Tulsa, with the mass grave excavation, I raised a question about making sure that this is still treated like the criminal investigation that it is. And that suggestion was quickly like discarded. Well, you know, the people who did it, well, it happened 100 years ago, they're pretty much all dead. I said, first of all, we can't be that presumptuous. None of us have done an investigation to know if that's the fact, because the DA and the state attorney general has never investigated. The worst crime in this city and state's history has never been investigated. And I said, and secondly, even though people may be dead, if we wanted to entertain that argument, the institutions that caused the race massacre, like the city of Tulsa, the fire department that didn't put out one fire, the police department that didn't make one arrest, they're still in existence, right? So you can't just quickly discard it. But unfortunately, if you're getting paid by the city to do this excavation, then it kind of limits what you are possibly able to do. And so I would say if scientists can be independent, if they could, I love the fact that this organization exists, AAAS, because, you know, you all help provide some resources, and that's what's needed, you know, in the scientific arena, for scientists to be independent and unbought and unbiased. And I'm not saying that that's the case here, but just the appearance sometimes. If you were doing research and you're going to just write off a whole segment of possible perpetrators and say we're not going to focus on them, and they're the ones who are paying for this study, it kind of looks a little suspect to me. So yeah, those are my just little tidbits of advice.
Yeah, I think that something that scientists often don't appreciate explicitly is power dynamics and the immense power that science and scientific authority has, and how we choose to wield that power or not is really telling. So thank you for sharing those comments. I did want to expand it a bit to talk about something that we sometimes emphasize in our discussions. This conversation, you know, includes some really sobering topics. I also wanted to maybe talk about some positive and enriching elements of some of the work that you've done in trying to uncover silent stories. And I wonder if each of you could share from your work or from your experiences times where you've really been surprised or awestruck or you know had kind of a really positive experience in exploring these silent stories in your work.
I'll start us off. I think that first I want to say that, you know, thank you, Reverend Turner, because I think it's very, very important that the entire country knows when you say Tulsa, Oklahoma, that you understand and know about Greenwood. And it's not something, and the 1921 massacre, and I don't think it's something that is taught with the energy that it should be. So I just wanted to start with that. But I do have to say that when I was writing my book, my first book, I really was moved by, because I wanted to have different aspects of how, you know, my approach to archaeology could be seen in different case studies. And the one that stands out in my mind the most is what is called Lucy Foster's Acre, which is here in Andover, Massachusetts. She was a woman born into slavery in Boston, freed when she was 16, but stayed in service of the people that had originally bought her. She was, you know, it's difficult, although Massachusetts was this bastion of abolition, right? It wasn't that easy to be Black or Indigenous and free, right? Because your movements were by law, they were legally constricted. So I learned about Lucy Foster through, her site was the first excavation in the United States of a site specifically of an African-American person, right? But it was called Black Lucy's Garden. And I said, that didn't sit right with me. So everyone talks about Black Lucy's Garden, and I'm like, what is this woman's name? And can we actually name her and stop calling her outside of her name? Like, I didn't know why that was necessary. So her site, to just reinterpret and just look at some of the things and the arguments that were about her site. And it was all about, using a plantation model on a woman that was free, had an acre of land and a cow, right? And materially, she was wealthy with material, right? With eyeglasses, thimbles, plates, dishes, cups, you name it, she had it in her possession, right? That was in her house. And so her implication, she might have been involved in the early Underground Railroad in getting people to freedom, but she was never looked at that. It was just looked at as this random site. So I tackled that. And then years later, this is about 3 years now, a group of young women from a private school, Penguin Hall Academy, sorry, a private school out in Eastern Massachusetts, contacted me. Long story short, they were raising money because they read the story of Lucy Foster, they did the research, and their mission was to give her a headstone at the church in which she worshiped for more than 30 years. And she was an active member of the community. So what they did is we met, we talked about what was going to be on her tombstone. They did it in the way it would have been during the time of her death. And it was a beautiful moment for that to come full circle. These young women, most of which did not look like me, but what was important for them is we had a ceremony in the church. The pastor of that church welcomed the story of Lucy, but also the fact that now she has a place in Andover history where she's not going to be erased, because she had no headstone, but we knew where she was buried. And so for me, that was me getting upset about this site being called Black Lucy's Garden and not being taught as the first site of an African-American in this country, but instead bringing her not only some recognition as the significance of her house, but also the fact that now she is a part of the story of Andover. And it says born into slavery and born into captivity in Boston, lived in freedom in Andover. And it says seen by God or known by God and her community. And that's what's on her gravestone, because she was an active member of her community. And she wasn't poor and impoverished. She was a woman that had power and had some meaning in that space, even though she was born into slavery. And so that for me is one of those positive stories that kind of comes full circle and helps me to get through those rough times that I experience every now and then.
It's really inspiring. That's a beautiful story. I'm glad you were part of that, and that you were able to be in the role to get that headstone made. I actually kind of want to respond to the Reverend here, and I agree. I think that oftentimes many of my peers, because we have received a lot of formal education, we don't have humility in talking with other people. And it's extremely problematic. And this is actually, it trickles down into our institutions. I've been faced when I have to do ethical reviews before doing a study. I've been asked, oh, the people you want to work with, are they literate? And oftentimes I have to tell them, well, actually there's higher literacy rates in that country than, relative to the United States. And then secondly, just because you haven't gotten a formal education doesn't mean you don't know how to navigate the world. Doesn't mean you can't advocate for yourself. So I have to remind people of that, and I have, including my peers. So Reverend, I think you make an excellent point. I'll also add that for, certain research projects, particularly ones that are community involved, our funding institutions need to recognize we need the time and the resources to build relationship. Not to just go in there, collect samples and leave, but to go there, hang out, get to know people, have them get to know us, build a trust, ensure that what we are doing is something that is wanted in the community, And then at a later point, after everybody's had time to think about this, then commence with the study. So there actually needs to be changes, probably all up and down. So the funding structure, in terms of recognizing the importance of the community. In terms of my own experiences, which have been really eye-opening or moving to me. There's actually several, but one of them was a project I was doing in St. Vincent. I was working with the Garifuna community, and the Garifuna are basically an African and indigenous community, just kind of a long history. There's the story of exile and return. But for those indigenous, Afro-indigenous, or even indigenous people that have remained on the island, there's a lot of stigma around being indigenous or native. And up until, I would say, even more recently, calling someone Indian or native was pejorative. It was, you were saying that they were promiscuous or lazy or all these other horrible, horrible things. And as I was doing the work and trying to recruit and talk to people and get a sense of what happened in this community, one of the women who was assisting me in the field just sort of made an offhand comment about, seeing you here doing this work is making me rethink my ideas about my own identity. And like, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm not, scared to say, yeah, I am of this group. And I know this may never, amount to any large, huge movement, but at least for one person, my work changed how she thought about her past, about herself, about her island. And for me, then, that made my day. That actually made it still makes my day, just to think about the little impacts that I could potentially make in shaping how people come to terms with the histories of colonization that many of us have to live with.
Thank you both. Sorry, Reverend Turner, did you also want to respond?
Oh, no, I appreciate the question about science helping silence communities, because far too often, the history of my community, African American, science has not only silenced but oppressed communities. I'm from Tuskegee, and I was born in John Andrew Hospital, the oldest, the first Black hospital in Alabama, and the last. Where from 1932 to 1972, the government gave syphilis to Black men. One of the main problems where people don't want to get the COVID vaccine today is because they remember what happened in Tuskegee. And I mean, I still support people getting the vaccine, but we have to understand science has been utilized from not just the Tuskegee syphilis study, but Henrietta Lacks, and the study on Black women, Josiah Knox. The cranial capacity, one of the leading physical anthropologists in the country at the time in the 1800s, supported slavery, came up with this notion of genetic polygenism. It's like we all came from different places. And so I think that I'm encouraged so much, Dr. O'Malley, by this forum, because I think science, as religion has been used so much to oppress people. And silence marginalized groups and exploit, like leading gynecologists, historians experiment on Black women, and so I think that it's good that you all are now seeking to be at the forefront of that, and I hope it continues. One example of the positive use for science I've seen historically and current day. Even though I disagree with some of the bureaucratic processes with the mass grave excavation in Tulsa, it's still a great thing that we're actually excavating bodies and exhuming bodies. That is a great thing. That is bringing people who have been in the ground for too long out, literally. Giving them voice, right? I wish the process was done in the way that Dr. Torres just mentioned. That I wish they had more collaboration early on with the community, but the case is what it is today. And another historical example of science giving voice from Tuskegee, George Washington Carver, who was a great scientist in Tuskegee and went there at the request of Booker T. Washington, and while he was there, saw farmers complaining that their soil was nutrient poor because cotton takes nutrients out the soil. So what George Washington Carver referred those farmers do was to plant things that enrich the soil. And one of the things that enrich the soil are peanuts. And so they did that, but as a result, they had more peanuts than they could use. So they gave him all the extra peanuts, and he came up with over 300 inventions using just peanuts. So, and he never took a dime for any one of his inventions because he said God gave him that knowledge. So I've seen the best of science in Tuskegee and also the worst of science. But I still think that we have some brighter days ahead.
Thank you all for your comments. I think that we're going to be ending in just a minute here, but I wanted to invite any of you to share if there's a book or a movie that you would love to see gain more visibility relevant to science. I'm wondering if you could share that here for people to investigate.
I would just say read the books of the people who are on this panel, Dr. Whitney Battle Batiste and Dr. Torres. Read their books and you can learn as much as you need to know.
I think that Dr. Torres did give us some great reading, which I wrote down, because Dorothy Roberts is probably the only one that I've actually looked at. But I would say there's amazing books coming out, and we're writing them, and so I think please open yourself up to look at the connection between people and science.
I would absolutely agree. Dorothy Roberts, Harriet Washington has good books. Medical Apartheid is her book. And then Deirdre, I think it's Cooper Owens or Owens Cooper. She has a book called Medical Bondage. Also a great, it's hard to read it just because it's very emotional, but it's extremely, extremely informative. But those are all great reads.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Thank you again to this fantastic panel. You've given me personally at least a great deal to reflect on. I'm really grateful for your time in this challenging moment and joining us remotely. I would also want to just add, we did post some links to Joycelyn Davis's organizations, the Clotilda Descendants Association and Africatown Chess, and I would encourage everyone to check those out as well because it is a fantastic story. Thank you again for joining us, and best wishes and health and safety to everyone and their families.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.